Welcome to the first episode of What in the Health with your co-hosts Eric, Rena, and Fatiha. After months of planning and recording, we're very excited to present our first podcast episode, College and COVID-19. Today, we'll be talking about the implications of COVID-19 on student life with Vishal, who's a student at the University of Georgia, and Julia and Lola, who are students at the University of Michigan. We also had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Panagis Galiatsatos, also known as Dr. G, a pulmonary critical care doctor and assistant professor at the Hopkins School of Medicine.
As college students ourselves, we recognize the challenges involved in remote learning. Many students would prefer to have classes in person, but as we've heard from the CDC, there's a lot of risk involved with holding classes in person during a pandemic. We asked Julia and Lola, two students at UMich, about the quality of their education amidst COVID-19.
Yeah, Julia had one of the more nuanced takes out of all the students that we interviewed. And here's what she had to say about balancing risk while maintaining a good quality education.
I do think that some of the risky behaviors are justified in terms of upholding an educational value. So one of those might be, I had a chemistry lab this semester that was in person, which of course is riskier than it not being in person, but they did take proper precautions. No one was in 6 feet of each other. All the lab equipment was sanitized like crazy. People were wearing face shields. That kind of stuff, certainly better than doing lab online. And I do think it's worth the risk. Then you move to some other classes or programs, such as my in-person lecture for accounting. I think that was just completely not worth the risk. I didn't gain any extra educational value.
I think on the other end of the spectrum, we can see Lola's opinions, where she considers handling risk a higher priority in the reopening process, which was clearly different from what Julia was saying.
I think they should have been moved online sooner. I think like a lot of classes, like they wanted to keep as much classes in person as possible because obviously the learning difference between being in person and online is much different, but they just didn't move them online. So they didn't move them online for that reason.
Based on these differing opinions, it's clear that there isn't just one answer to whether schools should have been all online or follow a hybrid model. It's hard to balance the pros and cons of each. Julia brought up a great point of having classes like labs in person because you can't really do a chemistry experiment in front of a screen and learn much from it. This then led us to the question, can we still have a quality education if it's all online? Here's what Dr. G had to say.
I think at this moment we all have to, I don't think we have to sacrifice. I think we just have to adapt. I mean, that's what human beings are good at. I'm sitting here talking to you guys on a Zoom call. Like we are adapting, right? We're not going into a studio to do this, and you guys are still going to put out an amazing product. We adapt, right? Human ingenuity has always adapted. We've always done that.
So I think it was interesting that Hopkins itself decided to go remote and online with all of its classes, including labs. And for me, I'm a public health studies and economics major. I feel like for me, I didn't feel that much of a difference taking online classes. I personally can't think of any classes that I'm taking that should have been in person or really had a difficult time being online.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, the ones that are most justified seem to be like the scientific labs. I think Julia was saying that, how, it's really hard to do scientific experiments over Zoom. A lot of times you end up just watching professors do the experiment for you, and it's really not the same experience.
Yeah, Rena, you're taking a couple of labs this semester, right? What's that process been like? Do you personally agree that like labs should be in person?
Yeah, so I'm taking developmental genetics lab this semester, and it's pretty much impossible. I mean, I'm taking the class online, but to actually learn how to do stuff in the class, it's pretty much impossible online. Like we have to work with, worms and CRISPR, and just like looking at a picture of it doesn't really add to the experience. So yeah, I definitely agree with Julia in that these science labs might have been best in person, but again, there's still a lot of risk involved with that.
Yeah, I think everyone was pretty confident that lectures would translate fine into the online format. I think, you're basically just watching a professor talk either way anyway. I think people had concerns about discussion classes, but for me, most of those went pretty well. I felt like we were able to innovate. We were able to find ways to, not talk over each other, and kind of get everyone to share. So I think overall it was a pretty good experience for me this semester. Do you guys have any classes like that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I was taking a class called Invitation to Anthropology this semester. And to be honest, I didn't know what to expect taking a class that's so discussion and reading heavy online. But personally, I feel like it worked out fine. Granted that I do live in the same time zone as when the classes were conducted. So I didn't have to worry about, am I going to make it to section or not? Or do I have to view a recording? So taking that into consideration, it was a great time just being able to talk in different breakout rooms.
Yeah, a lot of the classes I'm taking are in the sociology and international studies departments, and those usually attract kids from all over the world, a lot of international students. And I'm sitting in those classes looking at my peers on their Zoom screens, and half of them, it's like pitch black outside their windows, and I'm sitting here like I just woke up. So I really can't imagine having that experience and having to deal with that. That definitely sounds like more difficult.
I think an interesting point Dr. G had made is when he was saying, I don't think we have to sacrifice. I think we just have to adapt. And although I do see a lot of value in that point, for me, Eric, you were just mentioning international students. I'm thinking about the students who do have to adapt by waking up in a different time or setting their schedules up differently than they would have had they been on campus. And with that adaptability, doesn't there come a certain level of sacrifice when maybe you aren't able to participate in lectures in person because you're stuck watching a recording, or you're not learning as much from an online lab class because you're not able to do the experiments yourself in person? I guess for me, just that comment has me thinking, to what extent can we see adaptability and sacrifice hand in hand, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, going off of that, I was also thinking about the teacher's perspective because, they were told a very short period of time before school started, oh, you have to go all online. Oh, just adapt your class to work in that format. And that's pretty stressful for them too. I mean, a lot of these professors would much rather have in-person lectures. They don't know how to engage with students over a computer. So I feel bad for these professors. I feel like they've been going through a lot. We're all going through a lot. It's difficult to just say adapt and move on.
I think also in hindsight, I think it was worth asking the different schools and students that we interviewed if they also saw that faculty were told to just adapt. Because I know Hopkins specifically, when I was talking to different professors, they told me that they didn't have a lot of time to change their curriculum from being in person to online. But I wonder if that's a circumstance just exclusive to Hopkins or something that was also happening at, for example, UGA and UMich.
Yeah, one of my better experiences this semester came from a professor who regularly teaches classes online, like over the summer or even during the semester. He does a lot of classes where it's just online only completely. And so he was like super good about adapting his class. He thought it was best to do one of our lectures every week totally online so people didn't show up, and then one lecture in person, and then we have section. And even during that one in-person lecture, he would have polls going off. He would be using the breakout rooms really well. He'd be sending us work. We do it in the breakout room. We email it to him. And it was really like, it felt like a very interactive class, despite it being a large lecture online. And, it's great for professors like that. But if you're not someone with all of that experience under your belt, how are you, like, these teachers are barely able to figure out how to do basic things in Zoom. How are they going to figure out how to make it more interactive?
Yeah, just to sum it up, I think I knew that there was a spectrum of different student opinions in regards to whether or not having in-person classes were justified or not. What I hadn't considered prior to these conversations was the relationship between adaptability and sacrifice. So I think moving forward, it's something that I'm going to have to think about a lot more, even in circumstances outside of the pandemic.
One of the other topics we spent a lot of time on with our interviewees was testing. When talking about the pros and cons of learning environments during COVID-19, we spent a significant amount of time understanding how each of their schools developed and enacted policies to keep the transmission of COVID minimal. When talking to each of the student interviewees about their school's health interventions, it was interesting to hear how testing seemed to be a major component of each of the school's plans.
Yeah, I specifically remember Vishal describing all the health interventions that UGA was enacting to navigate COVID, and he had specifically spent a lot of time talking about its testing policies.
Going into fall, there was minimal surveillance testing, no mandated symptom reporting. We have this thing called dog check where you self-report if you have any symptoms, if you have COVID. And that honestly, that's as limited as it was.
Yeah, Vishal's concerns about testing wasn't a unique situation. All of our interviews stressed the importance of testing and how a lack of testing was a common theme in every school. And we hear this all the time in the media as well. It's always in order to better tackle COVID, we need more testing and surveillance. And it seems like the more testing we have, the more that we can get over this. But we wondered, is this really the answer? Here's what Dr. G said about testing.
You got to have the hygienic intervention supplemented with testing. And regardless of what testing you use, fine, just make sure you tell that to the audience you're testing it on. Like, hey, you can get daily testing if you need it, or, once a week or however long, but you got to emphasize hygienic interventions at the same time. You can't rely solely on a testing only intervention.
Yeah, I mean, for the schools that really kind of thought testing would be this kind of savior in their plans, it's just kind of amazing how still inadequate they were, like especially UGA. When we talked to Vishal, like 300 tests a week for tens of thousands of student and faculty is a ridiculous number, and it was all volunteer based. Like you're not going to have an accurate picture of COVID's transmission at your school with that methodology.
And then there's also issues with what kind of test you're administering. If it's, a fast result test, it's probably not the most accurate. But if you're waiting, a week to get your test results in, you might already be sick by then. And, who knows how many people you've been in contact with. So testing, in my opinion, is really just a question of school resources and money. If they have the money for tests, like Hopkins apparently has the money for tests because they're planning on testing all of us twice a week. But these huge schools, it might just not be possible to test every single person. And so, this is where Dr. G stressed the hygienic interventions that are, I feel like, sometimes overlooked in a lot of these large campuses.
Yeah, I definitely agree that they were overlooked. I think schools seem to just kind of accept that students weren't going to do these things. And so instead of saying, okay, then we can't come back, they said, okay, then we're going to pretend like testing is going to fix it. I think we saw that in UMich, where COVID started to spread and the administrators blamed the students, and it's probably true. The students probably weren't following COVID guidelines. But at the same time, you're the one who made the decision to bring everyone back. You're the one who made, knowing that this stuff was going to happen,
Yeah, and I also feel like when it comes to hygienic interventions, such as wearing a mask, washing your hands, maintaining social distancing requirements, because they're such simple actions to follow up on, I say from my community, I feel like a lot of people just take it for granted in terms of its effectiveness and its power in really keeping COVID rates low. And I wonder, the reason why we hear so much about testing policies when it comes to school policies, although schools have so many rules and regulations, most of our interviews really narrowed in on testing. I wonder if that's because it's what we see the media talk about the most, right? Like when we look at news articles, whether that's from a school newspaper or just CNN or any other news outlet in general, most of the articles are about testing rates and developments in testing plans and accuracies, and not necessarily the hygienic interventions. So I think it's worth delving deeper into understanding why hygienic interventions haven't been as much of a priority in most of the conversations that I've heard regarding COVID-19 right now.
Yeah, and then the thing with testing is that, once you get a positive, case, you need contact tracing in order for the testing to actually be worth it in the long run. And I feel like a lot of these college campuses aren't really putting a lot of emphasis on contact tracing. And so, yeah, Dr. G is right on point with really stressing these hygienic interventions because, if you have testing but no contact tracing, it's really not working.
Yeah, I think especially at the beginning of the pandemic, you can kind of see these weird priorities in play. There were all these news stories. Oh, we don't have enough testing. Oh, we're going to have these like government run mandatory ways of contact tracing in some states. And yeah, I like the word taken for granted. I think there were some mask mandates. Rarely was social distancing actually enforced, but Dr. G seemed to think these are the things that matter. Like, okay, you don't have enough tests. That's not great, but you can still social distance and wear masks so you can stop the spread. You don't need tests to stop the spread. And you just really wish you would see more people actually have their priorities in that order. Overall, all of the people we interviewed seemed to think that testing was a really important part of a college's plan to return back to campus in person. But regardless, it seems that testing is not the most important thing, nor is it the only thing that can help slow the spread of COVID, even if we're in person. According to Dr. G, we're going to need to really emphasize wearing masks, staying 6 feet apart as much as possible, and those hygienic interventions that we mentioned.
While we were talking about opinions on different academic policies and testing strategies, another topic that came up during our conversations was community health. As we were having conversations focused on how COVID impacted student life on campus, something that really stood out to me was understanding the relationship between college campuses and their surrounding communities. Specifically, recognizing the fact that how colleges navigate COVID has direct impacts on the health and well-being of extended communities was a very valuable insight to consider.
Here's Vishal discussing the impact that the UGA campus had on its surrounding community of Athens, Georgia.
Not even the campus, but like the greater Athens community. It was kind of like sad that like Athens cases started spiking once UGA came back in session, and then there was a whole thing where some UGA students kind of blamed Athens for like treating the Greek life on UGA differently from like the bars in Athens.
It seems like the community of Athens was very concerned about so many cases coming from UGA. And this isn't a unique situation. A packed college campus isn't exactly the best place to be during a pandemic, no matter where you are in the country. When we talked to Dr. G, we asked him what colleges can do if their policies start to impact the neighboring communities.
So what I would say to those colleges is, look what's happening in the communities around you. If your prevalence of COVID-19 is really, really high, maybe take a step back. Maybe pause, take a step back, and you know what? Do what's right for the students and for your own community and say, hey, let's prevail in education through online in some capacity.
I think something that's worth considering is that not all colleges are kind of in the middle of really large, bustling communities or have a relationship in which the circumstances of the campus is going to directly impact the community, right? Like there are a lot of college campuses that are kind of isolated away from their communities. And, it just made me wonder, how do we determine if a college campus deeply impacts the daily life and circumstances of a community? Like, should we only look at this from a public health perspective in terms of COVID cases, or are there other perspectives such as, I'm not even sure, like economics or something that would help us come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down. I think economic is an important aspect of this, right? I think when so many people are thinking about college towns or even just the surrounding area of any college, they kind of think about what the students bring to the area, right? All these shops that open up in college towns that are basically just profiting off of students coming and doing business. And, people don't really think about what dangers the students can provide, especially in a case like this that's so novel. And I think it's just not something that crosses your average college student's mind,
Yeah, that reminds me specifically of a moment in Vishal's interview where he was mentioning how in Athens, a lot of the bars decided to have different operating hours in light of the pandemic So what did the students decide to do? They're all going to kind of group together and go to the bar at the same time and have the same issue of just overcrowded spaces. And it's not just the students that are going to the bars, right? The community members are probably also going to the bars, but just having so many students in one place at the same time, it just got me thinking about what are ways that the actions of the students are really hurting the communities around them. But I feel like students might not even consider it because we're so used to, for the most part, really thinking we're on campus. It's never we're in some type of city or surrounding community.
Yeah, and I think it's so common for college students to show up on campus, think like, wow, I'm away from my parents, I'm away from my hometown, this is my new stomping ground, and meanwhile, there are people just a block away from them that have been living there their whole lives. And it's just, it's really not a way that we think about college towns, college campuses. But it really should. Like, when colleges are making these decisions that have to do with their profit, their students, their faculty, their property, there should be community members on those boards in those conversations, because no college exists in a vacuum. Even the ones that are in the middle of nowhere in the country, there are stores around that are run by people who live there, and other, there's people everywhere, even in these smaller colleges. And every college should have to take into account the opinions, the safety of their communities.
Yeah. And Eric, as you were mentioning the fact that, students come onto a different city or a different community for college and think of it as their stomping ground, while people have been living their whole lives in that same place a block away, it really got me thinking about my own experience moving to Baltimore to come to Hopkins, and how, for a couple of months, I really saw Hopkins as this bubble in Baltimore. And I saw it as like my playground almost, to explore a new area and, do whatever I wanted as a college student. And it wasn't until I really started interacting with the community through different clubs and programs where I recognized that the city was just full of so much history and culture. And, me being there as a college student it shouldn't take away from the fact that generations have been living in the blocks around campus, and that there's so much action involved within the community in terms of health, in terms of just supporting businesses and whatnot. It's kind of surprising to me that I hadn't recognized that immediately while setting foot on campus. And I wonder why that I thought that way.
Yeah, I think, like many problems, the pandemic has simply exacerbated existing problems. And I think this situation isn't too much different. I think there's a real problem of college students going to faraway places, getting their education, and then going back home and working, and basically giving nothing to the communities that they lived in and gained from for 4 years. And, it's not like a huge problem. It's not like they're like really exploiting these places, but college students really should. They should get involved with these communities. They should learn about them at least, and you get out there, explore them. There's so much to take in these communities. And the fact that they're not considering these communities is just something that is even getting shown and exposed more and more by this pandemic.
I think a key takeaway from the conversations that we've had surrounding community health is that the outcomes of health within a college campus and a community are deeply integrated. And I think it's really worth considering how your own actions as a college student on campus impact your community, regardless of if it's associated with the pandemic or not, right? Like, I think just having that reflection and that recognition of understanding that your actions can have longstanding consequences is really valuable.
Something that we briefly touched on at the beginning of the episode was that there are many stakeholders when it comes to making decisions during a pandemic, whether that be from the perspective of students, faculty, medical professionals, or community members. And the people we mentioned above were involved in various capacities at their respective schools, resulting in its own consequences.
Colleges have spent months planning their fall semesters this year, But despite being one of the largest groups on campus, students and faculty have felt like they've had no say in the development of these plans. When we talked to Julia, she described one specific conflict between the UMich administration and the grad student instructors, or she refers to them GSI.
And then about week 3 of classes, there was a huge strike by the GSI population at Michigan, which actually ended up in a union bust on Labor Day. So that was a bad look for the entire university. But they were striking mostly due to really poor conditions, being forced to do in-person classes and not having a virtual option for a lot of their sections that they were at the acting GSI for.
Similar to what had happened at UMich, the students and faculty at UGA also felt like they had no power over the planning and execution of COVID policies. Specifically, Vishal described a conflict that involved the faculty.
But student input was very limited. Even professor input was kind of suppressed. There was a kind of petition going around signed by 300-ish faculty to say, hey, we need to move online within the next few weeks. Otherwise, we're going to have like thousands of cases on campus.
I think something that Hopkins did well, or at least I took for granted prior to these conversations, were the town halls that were conducted in terms of what should the school do during COVID. I mean, I'm not sure what the turnout was like in each of the town halls, but knowing that that was there and that for schools like UMich and UGA, at least from the student perspective, wasn't really present was really shocking to me.
Yeah, I think Hopkins has had its fair shares of issues dealing with student input and whether they put it into place or not, and it still very much does. But yeah, I think it did a fairly decent job in regards to this area. I again, I didn't attend any of the town halls. I didn't have much to add, but I think just the fact that they exist, the fact that they're going to listen, you know, even if they're not a huge sway in what the university does, some of these schools that we talked to didn't even have anything. So I really kind of appreciated that.
Yeah, and now that I think about it, I kind of see the value in not really having a lot of student input, because if we were to just argue all day long about what students want versus what teachers want, that's going to last forever and there's not going to be any decisions made at the end of the day. So, I see the value in that, but still I feel like, if you're having strikes on campus from your students and your faculty, that's an issue.
Yeah, and I think that's where a sense of balance comes in. And I mean, we could argue all day about what balance means in this context specifically, and making plans, navigating COVID. But I think if your faculty or GSI, as Julia had put it, are on strike because they don't feel safe in their working conditions, I think that's something that's worth taking immediate action for and really noticing, because I can't imagine spending so many hours at a workplace or at an institution and constantly being paranoid about the different COVID guidelines when, I feel like as a workplace and especially as a college, there are at least educational resources available to understand the risks and to feel heard.
Yeah, I can't imagine being maybe an older professor or a grad student with some sort of pre-existing condition, or really anyone who's just scared of the pandemic because they should be. And having my school say, nope, you got to show up in person. You got to meet in a small classroom with closed doors with all these, with so many students. And meanwhile, you show up every day and you're just telling them something you could tell them online anyway. Like, I think especially when there's that obvious and easy alternative, it's just mind-boggling that so many administrations don't seem to care what their faculty have to say.
Yeah. And, I totally get that it's really complicated when you bring in the input of thousands of students and hundreds of faculty and public health officials and your own ideas as an admin. I guess what I'm really thinking about is, how do you incorporate all these stakeholders into a functioning system where people are able to give their input and actually have a healthy, sustainable policy system come out of it? I mean, I don't know the answer for that. And I don't know where we draw the line between there being involvement and there being too many voices to the point where, like at the end of the day, you are going to have to come to a decision. I know that. But again, just listening to what was going on at UGA and UMich, I feel like there could have been an opportunity for students to at least say something or feel heard to some capacity, rather than faculty and students feeling like they had to pursue a strike in order to be heard.
Before we move into our last topic, I want to briefly summarize some of the things we've brought up today. There are so many challenges regarding the pandemic, whether it's the quality of our education or how we can safely bring students back to campus. But a recent development in the pandemic was the approval of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines.
So when we talked to our interviewees about the vaccine, they had a lot to say. I think it was one of the more fascinating aspects of the pandemic so far. I think it's been on everyone's mind as we are looking for a light at the end of the tunnel here. So we spoke especially to Dr. G about this issue because he had a lot of insight for us about the future and about the vaccine and its implementation.
What's interesting is that a lot of people treat this vaccine as our saving grace. They think that these vaccines will, quote unquote, end the pandemic, and this optimism is really prevalent, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when we thought about this more, we thought, was the race against time to create this vaccine the best possible thing we could have done? And so we asked Dr. G, could we have done anything sooner? And he had some interesting things to say about the role of a vaccine in infectious diseases.
SARS-CoV in 2003 and MERS-CoV in 2013, both stopped without a single vaccine, both stopped without a single cure. This virus needs us to live. It needs us to live. It's like a plant that needs to be watered. If you don't give it a human being, it will die off. And we've got 2 moments in history where we've done that before. So by all means, follow through. So do I think we need to wait for a vaccine to do all this? No, I think if we can achieve good compliance with good leadership, with a consistent messaging that isn't politicized, I think we can get people to somewhat be adaptive to the way of life that we would want as we wait for this vaccine to kick in.
You know what? The virus does need me, not the other way around. I don't know. It was just a really interesting point, and I'm curious to know how you guys feel about just his comments overall.
I think it was definitely a thought-provoking answer. I don't think it was the answer we were expecting. I think we were expecting him to say, yeah, the vaccine's coming out. Maybe the problem will be that it'll be hard to get it to everyone as soon as possible, or distribution problems. But I think we were expecting kind of a lot of hope from him. But his answer was more cautionary. He was like, why are we just relying on this vaccine when there's so much we could be doing right now, or so much we could have been doing for the past however many months? And I think that was really insightful for me,
Yeah, and this comes back to the hygienic interventions too that we mentioned earlier. If we were all to stay inside and social distance, the virus can't spread. And, that's the whole goal of the CDC's recommendations right now. And yeah, it's interesting to see how we got over similar diseases like SARS and MERS without a vaccine. But, COVID-19 has just spiraled out of control, I guess, if you could say that.
Yeah, I think Dr. G still had, although he was cautionary about the entire situation, he still recognized the value of the vaccine, not only to prevent the disease, but also to sort of inspire change now. I think when we see a vaccine in sight, when we hear news about it possibly coming out before the year ends at the start of 2021, it inspires us to be like, okay, we can finish this. We can keep going with these hygienic interventions. We can do all the things we need to do because it's almost over. We've almost outlasted it. And I think that is really valuable. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it that I definitely hadn't really considered.
Y'all, as we were talking, I literally got a New York Times notification that's titled, "Is natural immunity to the virus better than a vaccine? Should you get the shot if you've already had COVID-19?" And the reason why I'm sharing this is because there's so many layers to just this vaccine alone. I didn't even think about what natural immunity had to do with COVID and the vaccine. And I don't know, as you were sharing Dr. G's commentary.
I was
found
going
it.
to say, like, I didn't think people who got it already would have to get vaccinated, but I feel like we don't actually know that. That's interesting. I don't even know.
Yeah, and that ties well into what Dr. G actually said earlier in the interview, is that we don't exactly know how COVID-19 works yet. We don't know why some people get more severe symptoms than others, or why some people get sick for months while others it's only just a few weeks. And the immune system is just so complicated that each person might need a different level of care depending on their unique situation. And so although I have high hopes for these vaccines, I still agree with Dr. G that the vaccine isn't the only solution here.
Yeah, and just the conversation of the pandemic can be taken in so many different directions when you think about like equity or health policy or access to health care, or how just individual health plays a role in this pandemic. For me, it's always, I've just had this like internal conflict understanding how to even frame the conversation surrounding the vaccine or just the pandemic in general, because I never want to come across as, not sensitive towards the other perspectives surrounding the pandemic, but I also don't want to contribute to the politicization of the pandemic, especially in a negative light.
I was going to say, I like the word you used, individual. I don't remember how you used it, but the kind of individualization of this problem. I think so often we look at public health issues as structural, and I think there's so much value in that. But one of the pitfalls we can find ourselves in is that we kind of neglect the individual and the individual's health, which is so important in medicine and in combating this virus. If we don't look at the things that are making each person spread or not spread the virus, then we're not going to understand what's making the whole society continue to spread.
At the end of the day, we hope that this episode empowered you to think about the various perspectives in navigating COVID-19 as a college student to make informed health decisions. For more information about COVID-19 in college, please visit our website withthepodcast.com. To share your thoughts and interact with us, follow us on Instagram at with_the podcast. As always, we appreciate your support.